What's up, everyone? Welcome to New World Economics, and today I have another reaction video for you. This one comes from CNN, and this is a press statement given from General Mark Milley, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the U.S. Army, so that makes him the top U.S. military commander. The title of the video is "Can Ukraine Push Out Russia? See Top U.S. General's Blunt Assessment." I'm going to be giving you my reactions to this. We're going to dive into what he says. It's not a very long video. It's about 3 minutes is his statement. Then there's a bit of a CNN discussion afterwards that we're going to analyze as well. So yeah, let's go ahead and just get right into it. Hopefully CNN's not too upset about me stealing their video.
Start with the Russians. Ukraine's a pretty big country. This is not a small piece of turf. And the probability of Russia achieving its strategic objectives, of conquering Ukraine, of overrunning Ukraine, the probability of that happening is close to zero. I suppose theoretically it's possible, maybe, I guess, but I don't see it happening militarily. So I just don't see that happening.
So, what he's saying right there, I think is pretty truthful. It's kind of how I see the situation. The flip side of it is, and there's a lot of people, obviously, that would argue this. There's probably going to be a lot of people that could argue this in the comments, is that Russia does have a significant and a very significant amount of military power that has not been deployed to Ukraine. And Mark Milley actually says that later on in the video. And people assume that should Russia commit its full force to going for Ukraine, they could probably achieve this goal of annexing the entirety of Ukraine. The question, more or less, though, I see that at this point as being rather risky. I'm not suggesting that that isn't like a future goal that Russia would want to achieve. I'm saying based on the situation right now, based on how much it's escalated, I would think that that would have been better done in some kind of blitz campaign in the beginning. It obviously wasn't the goal. Russia didn't attack with nearly enough troops, and now they have to worry about things like their other borders, like they have troops in the Far East defending their borders, in Central Asia defending their borders, in the Baltics, at Finland. They have some of the most extensive borders, or they do have the longest borders in the entire world, so they'd have to pool all their troops, all their resources together, something they're probably not willing to do. So, yeah, like in this current conflict, the task of Russia conquering Ukraine is probably close to zero. It is funny when he mentions, though, about how it's possible. We're going to come back to that later on in the video.
But they do currently occupy about 20% of that of Ukraine. So they occupy a piece of ground that's about 900 kilometers long. And I don't know, probably about 75 or 80 kilometers deep. So it's not a small piece of ground. And they invaded this country with upwards of 170, 180,000 troops in multiple field armies, combined arms armies.
So that's interesting because it kind of like is completely contradictory to what British intelligence has been saying from the beginning of the war. And if you read some of these reports, some of them are ridiculous. Now, I do think British intelligence is probably one of the better intelligence agencies out there, but England is far more politically aligned with the fate of Ukraine than the U.S. is, even though the U.S. is the leader of NATO and the leader of what seems to be the public leader of Ukrainian support. I led to believe that it's more or less the UK that's doing most of the military support. They don't have the economic power to provide them what we're providing them, so we're handling that aspect of it. But the point is the UK is going to skew things in favor of Ukraine. But they've been saying from the beginning that Russia has 90% of its troops within Ukraine engaged in the fight, and it's complete bullshit. Mark Milley says it right here. They only attacked with 180,000 troops. The entirety of the Russian army is well over 1 million. That including the different paramilitary forces that they use. Even their contract force is close to 300,000 troops. So that suggests that a number of their contract troops did not enter Ukraine, at least not immediately at the start of the war. There's a number of units that are stationed on the borders throughout Russia. There's definitely a couple contracts, higher skilled, not conscript units stationed around St. Petersburg, cultural capital of Russia. It's close to NATO borders, which they consider to be an enemy. So, of course, they want to keep enough forces in those areas to repel assault should it happen. There's also 2 brigades. I'm not really sure about both, but at least one of them is like one of the better Russian brigades that are stationed on the Kola Peninsula across from the Norwegian region of Finnmark, and it's thought that should a war break out, that Russia is going to rush and try to take that region based on those troops that are up there. So they do have significant contract forces that are stationed throughout Russia that have not entered the fight, some of which they probably did enter the fight, and there was never a plan for them to do so. But that's a whole different topic. There's still, obviously there's a lot of reservists, there's a lot of conscripts, and a lot more military equipment that Russia has that they haven't used.
And they have suffered a tremendous amount of casualties, but he's also done this mobilization and called up additional people. So the Russians have reinforced, and they still have significant Russian combat power inside Ukraine. Now, Ukraine's had great success in the defense. They did a tremendous job in defeating the Russian offensive. It's incredible what they were able to do. And then they went on the offensive at the beginning of September. And they had great success up in Kharkiv, and they've had better success even down in Kherson, as you just witnessed. But Kherson and Kharkiv, physically, geographically, are relatively small compared to the whole. So a lot to unpack there. I would say it's more or less the other way around, where Kharkiv was the better offensive or military success than Kherson. Obviously, Kherson's a better prize, but more or less that was just a successful strategic bombing campaign where the Russians were forced out based on bad logistics. There wasn't actually a Ukrainian assault that pushed them out of there. But in the case of Kharkiv, there was definitely a situation that showed some pretty serious skill on behalf of the local commanders and the troops that were involved, where they conducted some pretty successful deep battle operations, getting in behind Russian lines, really wreaking havoc on the Russians in Kharkiv region. Of course, there's a debate on really how much damage was done and really how many Russian troops were present. It seems like the evidence suggests that the Russian lines in the area were actually kind of thin. They had moved troops out of the region to go defend Kherson, actually. Which is interesting because they ended up losing both of them. But, that remains. The statement that he said about them actually being pretty small, real quick, we're going to look at this graph right here. I just shared this on my Telegram. It came out a little while ago. It doesn't show November on here, so not all of this is under Russian control still. But this is a graph basically shows how much of the country that Russia occupies. And you see here towards the end, of course, like you had the beginning, they started off with 7% of the country, Crimea and the Donbass. They nearly doubled that in the first week of the invasion, and then more than tripled it by the end of March. But then, of course, there's withdrawal from Kyiv and withdrawal from the north. And then you have the operations over the summer where Russia was capturing ground. Obviously, it doesn't look like they captured very much ground, right? You just have a little nick here. And then the Kharkiv offensive was right here beginning of September. And then this is the first attempt at the Kherson offensive here, or this was the after the Kharkiv offensive when the Russians broke, or when the Ukrainians broke Russian lines near Kryvyi Rog and they had to fall back 40-50 kilometers. That's that little jump right there. So it would go down a little bit more for November, but still the vast majority of the territory that the Russians captured is still occupied. It's a tall task for Ukraine to recapture that. The two parts that they have recaptured, Kharkiv and Kherson, were arguably the easier tasks, and I think that's what General Milley is saying. That the military task of militarily kicking the Russians physically out of Ukraine is a very difficult task. And it's not going to happen in the next couple of weeks unless the Russian army completely collapses, which is unlikely. So in terms of probability, the probability of a Ukrainian military victory, defined as kicking the Russians out of all of Ukraine, to include what they define or what they claim as Crimea, the probability of that happening anytime soon is not high, militarily. Politically, there may be a political solution where politically the Russians withdraw. That's possible. You want to negotiate from a position of strength. Russia right now is on.
So, like, that's from what I was saying at the beginning, like saying, basically the same, he's using the same meaning and applying it to 4 different topics, right? Like, so at the beginning, he opens up and he says that the likelihood that Russia captures all of Ukraine is 0, but possible, and then he says, the likelihood that Ukraine achieves a military victory, defined as kicking Russia out of Ukraine, is unlikely, so like basically, he's saying the same thing. It's unlikely, then he's saying, the chance of the Russian army collapsing is very unlikely, and then he's saying the chance of a political settlement where they come to an agreement and Russia decides willingly to withdraw from Ukraine is possible, but not very likely. So all these things are unlikely, but always possible. But he tends to phrase them kind of differently depending on which one it is, to kind of to make the situation sound better than it is, I guess. Like he puts more negative emphasis on Russia capturing all of Ukraine, leaves more of a possibility open for Ukrainian victory, but like you can tell that he obviously doesn't think that that's a real possibility, which I would argue he's probably right.
On its back. The Russian military is suffering tremendously. Leaders have been, their leadership is really hurting bad. They've lost a lot of casualties, killed and wounded. They've lost, I won't go over exact numbers because they're classified, but they've lost a tremendous amount of their tanks and their infantry fighting vehicles. They've lost a lot of their 4th and 5th generation fighters.
So let's talk about that real quick, because Ukrainian casualty numbers are classified by the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian government. And of course, the U.S. and NATO and stuff aren't going to supersede the Ukrainians and report things that they don't, because they're friends, they're allies, right? So why is Russian casualty numbers classified? Right? Why is the enemy's casualty numbers classified? I understand with Ukraine, because it's like, if Ukraine's taken a lot of casualties, which it definitely seems like they are, and the Ukrainian public finds out, it could be demoralizing, like, oh, this is how many of our young men have gone, our young men and women have gone to war and have died. Let's say it's 100,000 dead, and a couple 100,000 wounded. Like, that's very demoralizing. That would scare people. That would probably have an impact on future recruitment and conscription numbers. People, if they felt like they were more likely to die, they would try to dodge the draft a little harder. So that's understandable. And also from the other angle, they don't want the Russians to know, whether or not they are successful in destroying Ukrainian formations, right? So like, it's understandable there. But why is in America Russian casualty numbers classified by our government, our military, right? Like, we send our money over there to help Ukraine. Like, shouldn't we get to know like how successful our javelins actually are? Like, rather than taking the propaganda numbers from the Ukrainian government, where they claim in the first week of the war they destroyed 600 Russian tanks or 700 Russian tanks with javelins. Like, I would assume that's like probably half of the armored force that Russia sent into the country, and it was destroyed on the first week. Let's just real quick bring that image back up. So the time period that Ukraine destroyed all those tanks is this time period right here, and Russia still managed to capture all of this with basically half of the force. Like, like obviously Ukraine fudges the numbers some for the Russian casualties. That's, I think, pretty well known by like sane people at this point. Like, and I'm not saying it's like a completely immoral thing to do. Like, they're a country at war. Like, propaganda to aid in the war effort is absolutely necessary. But, like, why do we have to suffer from propaganda that's meant for the Ukrainian population? Or is it meant for the Ukrainian population? Because a lot of it seems like it's meant for us. A lot of it seems like it's meant to keep up support in America for the war effort, so they can keep getting our money, keep getting our weapons, some of which, maybe we should send, maybe we shouldn't send. But, I'm of the opinion that, the American people deserve to have the facts so we can make educated decisions. And I just don't think classifying Russian casualty numbers and, the number of Russian pieces of equipment that have been destroyed, I don't think that's good enough to make good decisions. I will also point out that he mentioned that a lot of 4th and 5th generation fighters have been destroyed. There hasn't been any 5th generation fighters destroyed, at least not that I've seen yet.
And helicopters and so on and so forth. The Russian military is really hurting bad. So you want to negotiate at a time when you're at your strength and your opponent is at weakness. And it's possible, maybe, that there'll be a political solution. All I'm saying is there's a possibility for it. That's all I'm saying.
Top U.S. General Mark Milley says it is not likely that Ukraine will achieve an outright military victory against Russia. That is very significant. He went on to say they may have the upper hand, meaning Ukraine, in potential negotiations, though, because of recent wins in the battlefield. Listen. And with the Biden administration's stance. Kylie Atwood joins us now. How unaligned, then, are they?
Well, what's interesting here is that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff made similar comments last week, Poppy, where he encouraged publicly that the Ukrainians should be seizing diplomacy at this moment, because he said when there's an opportunity, they should seize it. But then you have National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who said, no. When he was asked about this in recent days, he said the position of the Biden administration is that the United States is going to strengthen Ukraine's hand.
You guys probably already know this because I've said it before, but I can't stand Jake Sullivan. In my opinion, he's a worm that thinks he's a snake just because he slithers. This guy is a real piece of work. And the main reason, why, and of course he's just a politician. Mark Milley's opinion means way more than Jake Sullivan's in terms of, foreign policy, if you ask me. But this is the guy that was pushing the stories. Basically, he worked for the Clinton campaign in 2016 and was caught. This is there's actual evidence for this. It's not per se a crime. That's the claim to say that what he did was a crime. But the Clinton campaign actively was pursuing pushing a scandal between the Trump campaign and Russiagate. So he, gave information or was involved with the giving of information to the FBI or the CIA to claim that there was a link between Trump corporations and Russia through the Russian Alpha Bank servers. So he was trying to say that they were communicating through the bank servers, and this started the whole Russia hoax, and that Donald Trump is a Putin Kremlin agent. There's a really interesting article written about this. This was actually tweeted out by him days before the election. He was initially the one that said there are connections between Alpha Bank and Trump organization. This is the most serious evidence we have yet that there's a tie between Trump and the Kremlin. Trump is a Kremlin agent, hear me out. I'm not a fan of Trump. I didn't vote for Trump, but it is extremely damaging. It was extremely damaging to the whole country to push a narrative for 4 years that the president, the democratically elected president of the United States, whether you like him or not, was working for a foreign power. It consumed the media and politics for the first 2 years. And as soon as it was all proved wrong, as soon as this Mueller report and everything comes out, it just disappears. No one's talking about it anymore. This is the guy that started all that, completely made it up, completely fabricated it because he knew it was damaging. And, honestly, the reasons are clear. He's a foreign policy expert. The Clinton campaign was very anti-Russian. this whole wing, and there's different parts of the Democratic Party, obviously, but this wing of the Democratic Party, the Clinton, Sullivan, not so much, but now Biden part. I would argue that Biden and Clinton, believed different things before all this went down, but like they've been anti-Russian for years. Like they've been all about laying the blame for domestic issues on Russia for years. Some of which, obviously, the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, was a real thing. That's the Russian agency that they set up just to basically conduct what you call agitprop on U.S. social media. So it didn't, regardless of like what people will tell you, it didn't have a goal of getting a specific member elect or a specific party or person elected, right? Like, of course, every country has their preferences on whether they want the Democrats or the Republicans in charge, and I'm sure Russia probably had their preferences. Maybe Trump was part of the preference, but if you look overall at the agitprop they were doing, they were propping up multiple people. They propped up Bernie Sanders. They propped up the Libertarian Party. They were reaching out. Like, one of the most infamous stories is like they set up a meeting through Facebook some in like Austin or Houston, Texas, for like a Muslim society, and then set up another meeting for a Texas secessionist society across the street. And then they didn't show up to either meeting, knowing other people would show up and there would be a street fight and the cops had to come. So like basically what they were trying to do in like agitprop is agitation propaganda, and they were just trying to cause problems and turmoils in the U.S. Like the goal wasn't to get someone specific elected. The goal was to cause instability in the U.S. So, yes, Russia, and they should be blamed for like trying to cause instability in the U.S., but, the whole Russia gate, like Trump's involved with them, is complete bullshit. This is the guy. He sucks. Okay.
In the war, and then they will seek diplomacy. They will seek a political solution when they want to. The United States isn't going to make that determination for them. So it's pretty striking.
And that's bullshit too, right? Like the U.S. is 100% the party in charge over the Ukrainian side of the war. Of course, like, the public is in support of Ukraine, and that's not what the public wants. The public wants Ukraine to make their own decisions. So the Biden administration is trying to portray that, but like, no, we're not going to negotiate on their behalf, but it's up to them. But like at the same time, you have all these things happening behind the scenes. You have Jake Sullivan actually going to Ukraine sometime like last week, and basically telling Zelensky that he cannot hold the position that Ukraine will never negotiate with Russia, or that passing laws in Ukraine banning negotiation talks with Russia as long as Vladimir Putin is president. That basically is saying we will never have peace with Russia. Like, he's always going to be the president. Like, it's not like a good position to take. So like, if the U.S. can go there and say those things, like, no, you're going to, backtrack on that. You're going to walk that back. Basically, or we're going to stop sending you weapons. Obviously, we're in charge. We're daddy here, right? Like, so, the prospect of, Ukraine being in charge of their own negotiations is really just a fallacy.
That Milley came out just yesterday and sort of doubled down on what he said, even though it doesn't match the approach of the Biden administration at large here. And we should note that it has sent some Ukrainians with questions as to who to listen to in the Biden administration, even though President Biden himself has been very clear in saying the Ukrainians are going to dictate any political solution here, any diplomatic solution here. There are questions when you have the top U.S. general saying that maybe this is the moment for diplomacy.
You certainly do. Before you go, Kylie, you have some new
it's obviously very clearly what Milley's saying is right. Like, politically, you have to look at the situation. Like, Russia hasn't made any gains in the last couple months. It maybe could have been different had Russia managed to take Soledar, Bakhmut, or Seversk, or like one of these frontline cities sometime over the last 2 months. Could have mitigated some of the negative media coverage that Putin's getting inside of Russia. It probably could have raised morale some, because, obviously Russia controls their information just like Ukraine controls their information. So, if Russia is having successes on the battlefield, they sell the successes to their people, and they don't talk about the losses, but when the only thing that's happening is losses, like, a lot of the best and clearest, I'm not going to say best, but the clearest reporting on these situations is coming from pro-Russian Telegram channels. So the Russian people are learning of these failures on the battlefield, before the West is even talking about it, so like, it's a difficult situation that Putin's in and that Russia's in right now for sure. Whether or not they can turn it around, like, that's not what we're talking about. It's possible, maybe not, but like, Ukraine is coming in on some momentum. They have a couple battlefield victories. At this point, Putin would be crazy not to take a white peace / ceasefire if offered, which basically means that status quo, nothing changes. We stop shooting at each other. The lines stay where they are right now. And that would be way more beneficial for Russia than for Ukraine, obviously, because Russia gains a lot of territory. I mean, undeniably, Russia gains territory. All the territory Ukraine has captured in the last couple of months, they originally had lost it first. So, Russia would gain territory out of that deal. They could probably sell it as a good thing to their people. But at this point, like, it's risky to not try and go after peace, in my opinion. Like, if you're Ukraine, you have to consider that there's a possibility that the gains get reversed, or that, like, the best you were going to do was the last couple months, like, maybe not, like, maybe they recapture some more ground, but, you have to admit, like, you can't predict the future. It's going to go one way or the other. Either they're going to take back more ground, or they're going to lose more ground, or it's going to stay the same. You think of the latter two. If they lose more ground, if it stays the same, how many more people die? Like, how much more could you lose in that time period? I think if you can, you try to get peace. So, but obviously, like, that's up to Ukraine. That's up to Zelensky, or it's up to Joe Biden. But it's up to Zelensky. So, we'll see.
Reporting of your own on what happened behind the scenes as information on that missile landed in Poland. What happened?
Yeah, so when the missile landed, President Biden was in Bali. It was 4 a.m. when the Secretary of State was woken in his hotel room with an aide knocking on his door and telling him what had happened. He immediately went into President Biden's room, where the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, and the president really huddled around and together collected all of the incoming information. In a way, it's kind of beneficial that they were all together in a hotel, even though this was a circumstance that everyone was fearing could happen. And as they went through that information, President Biden called the Polish president, and his national security advisor and the Secretary of State were in there for that phone call. And then the national security advisor made phone calls to the Ukrainians, essentially urging them not to get too far ahead, because...
So the rest of this, I believe, is just about the missile stuff, which I'm going to do another reaction video on. I actually have some very juicy information on that. But, like, basically, to sum that up, actually an interesting bit of news came out. The AP, the Associated Press, is the original media conglomerate that reported on this, right? Like, they were the ones that were like, a Russian missile struck Ukraine. And the correspondent, or the front lines reporter that did that, only went off of one source, and it's been a big angle of criticism for that reporter and for the AP in general. So they actually just fired that reporter, and they cited their own policies, and they said that, our policy is, unless it's extreme situations, if you're going to cite anonymous sources, it has to be 2 separate anonymous sources, which I think AP probably breaks those rules all the time. It's just a case of, like, this one was a bad one. Like, it basically could have started World War III, if we know that Russia has attacked a NATO country. So very irresponsible on that reporter's part. He has been fired. So anyways, that's the end of it. I'm actually kind of I hate saying I'm impressed with CNN, but, like, I expected the CNN panelists to be, like, way more biased and stuff, just based on, like, past experience with CNN. I do think that this war correspondent establishment CNN is marginally better than the woke CNN that we had before this war started. Of course, like, the CEO, I think his name was Jeff Zucker, was fired, and they've fired a number of the truly terrible anchors since then. And these two ladies on the show, they weren't too bad. They really just talked about the facts of what Milley was saying, and maybe a little opinionated, but it wasn't as bad as I expected CNN to be. So I will say that. Still not like a big watcher or fan, but let me know what you guys think. Where do you get your news? Do you get it from me? Do you get it from some kind of mainstream media? Breaking points, whatever. What do you think of Milley's statements? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.